Hi, everyone that's just coming in. We're going to get started soon. We'll just let people in for a minute or so. Okay, I think we're going to get started. I'm sure people will trickle in. Thank you all so much for coming. This is our fifth Diverse Voices event, I think. The very first one we had was almost a year ago now, which seems a bit crazy. I think that our playlist of videos is available on YouTube if you didn't manage to catch some of the previous ones, but I'll post a link to that later. Today's event is kind of part of celebrating the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which was actually on the 3rd of December, which is when we announced this event. And we've got a really great person that we're kind of interviewing today. But before we get into that, just a few kind of housekeeping things. So the way this works, if you haven't been before, is that we'll have a kind of more formal talk/question and answer session at the start for maybe about 20 minutes, and that will be recorded. And that's what will go onto YouTube afterwards. But then the second half is going to not be recorded, and it will become a much more informal Q&A. So you can think of questions as Charlie and I are talking, and you can post them either in the chat or you can save them to ask later in that kind of unrecorded section. There won't really be that many slides, but if you do want to make them bigger, then you can close the chat or make the screen bigger. And if you have any technical issues with Zoom, then it's the classic, you could try turning it off, turning it on again. Okay, so our speaker today is Dr. Charlie Williams. So Charlie studied geography and environmental science at the University of Sussex back in the noughties, and by his own admission has had a slightly unconventional career path since then. He actually went straight into a PhD and completed that in about 2.5 years, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more later. And then he moved to the University of Reading for a fellowship. Charlie is now at the University of Bristol, which he moved to in 2018, but also splits his time 50-50 with a senior research fellow role at UCL. And I'm going to hand over now to Charlie to introduce himself a bit more, and then he and I will have a bit more of a discussion. So Charlie, I'll stop sharing and hand over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Reagan. Thanks very much. Welcome to everybody who's been here. I can see from the participants that I actually know pretty well about half of you, which is perhaps not surprising given the audience. So thank you for turning up anyway to hear me bang on about stuff that you probably already know. Quick caveat before the questions is obviously this is called Diverse Voices. So it's not only about my career, but also my career in the context of disability, which is really something that I am not very familiar with doing. I don't really talk about disability, not because I am sensitive about it. You know, all questions are, nothing is off limit later. I don't mind talking about it, but I just don't think about it all the time. In many ways, I am a little bit of a paradox. I am clearly very, very disabled. For those of you who don't know me, I can barely lift a finger. I use a highly specialized electric wheelchair. I use a breathing machine that you can see. I have 24/7 care. There is quite literally, other than talking, nothing I can do for myself. So clearly, I would be deluded to say it doesn't impact every waking minute of life. But at the same time, I don't think about it. I don't wake up thinking about it. I don't live and breathe disability. I live and breathe climate change and my other interests and hobbies. There's nothing wrong with some disabled people who do make it in their life, but I don't. So just really for Reagan, really, please do keep reminding me as we go through that, why we are here. If I start banging on about other matters, just remind me that we are here to talk about the context as well. So, yeah, okay. So, yeah, whenever you're ready, fire away.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. So I thought we'd start with the big question, which is what got you into environmental sciences and was it something you were always interested in?
I mean, short, is interested in my parents were and are fanatical to the point of obsession about sailing and boating. To give you a context, when they were first married, they bought a boat before a house. Other young couples were saving for furniture, they were saving for sails and boat engines. So they were and are obsessed, and a tiny little fact that their son could not walk and never would walk was not going to stop them from sailing. So I spent almost all of my childhood and teenage years, every weekend, every school holiday, every spare moment on a boat, sailing the south coast, France, Spain, the whole local area, which I know now was a massive privilege, and I was very, very lucky. Whether my teenage self would have said the same thing, I don't know. But looking back on it, I know I was incredibly lucky. Not only because, well, for health reasons. Um, Obviously, I am very prone to colds and coughs and chest infections. The idea that sea air is good for you is a lot more than an old wives' tale, and it really did. I believe helped me whenever I feel ill, but also in terms of interests, it meant that from a very, very young age, even before school, I was interested in things like meteorology. At that time, I'd have called it the wind. I was interested in oceanography. At that point, I would have called them tides. I was interested in beach geomorphology, even though I didn't know it. So, being in the natural world, the maritime natural world, really led to my interest in the natural world. And obviously, as well as understanding it, as I got older, protecting it and trying to keep it from harm. That obviously led into well, at school. That meant that my favourite subject was geography because that's where you learn about these sort of things. Degree at university, I did geography again, but this time with environmental studies, and was always drawn to the idea of climate science and atmospheric science. And so I did my degree in geography, specializing in climatic type modules, before going straight into a PhD in, well, officially in physical geography, but in, 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 in reality, in climate science. So yeah, I guess it began at really a very, very young age.
And so what you just said, I know that typically people think they need to get a master's before they do a PhD, but things are changing a bit. How did you find going straight from your kind of undergraduate into the PhD?
Um, Probably not to be recommended. You're right. Typically, the standard route is degree, MSc, PhD. That was always the route I thought of doing. I applied to UEA and got accepted onto their MSc in climate change. But then after about a week or so after, I was offered the PhD position at the same university I was in already, Sussex. The only downside was that the supervisor, who was also my undergraduate dissertation supervisor, so I knew him already from that. The deal was that he had funding for the studies, so the PhD was funded, but no extra stipend or living costs. So I worked full time during my PhD as an associate tutor, so teaching undergraduate courses in geography. So I do regret not doing a master's. It would have given me, firstly, background. It would have given me research experience to do the master's dissertation. As it was, I went straight in, and so the learning curve during that first 6 months was probably a lot more severe than it could have been. Nowadays, I would, to all my students, I tell them strongly recommend a master's because that will help you decide whether or not you want to do a PhD. It's not for everybody, as it was suited to me, but yeah, it wasn't easy going straight into PhD.
And so you worked at the same time, but you did your PhD quite quickly. So what did you do for your PhD? What was the subject, and what was motivating you to get it done in 2.5 years?
Well, the first question is easy to answer. So my PhD was in Southern African rainfall, so it was looking at particularly extreme rainfall, with a case study of the Okavango Delta. So I spent a lot of time looking at extreme rainfall over the Okavango, and then I used a climate model, HANAM3, so the atmosphere only version of the model. Most people here will know exactly what that is. To simulate extreme rainfall, and I looked at the links between the South Atlantic and its controls on rainfall extremes. And my PhD basically demonstrated a mechanism between a warming South Atlantic and more extreme and variable rainfall. Why I did it so quickly, well, it wasn't intentional. And again, I certainly don't recommend doing it. It took a bit longer than 2.5 years. I think it was about 2 years, about 8 months in the end. The reason basically was because in my second year, I did two silly things. One, I applied for a postdoc at Reading, and two, I applied for a Royal Society fellowship. Both were considered more of a punt, if you like, to give me experience of applying for things. I never expected to get either, let alone both at the same time. So I had to finish quickly. I was basically working for the last 6 months. I was doing 13, 14 hours a day, every day, which is not ideal, even if you are fully fit and healthy. It's not particularly good for you. Obviously, I had extra complications, but I had to ignore them and just get on with it and finish the PhD. So, in terms of what motivated me to finish it, a job or two, in fact, but yeah, it's not ideal.
So then when you moved to Reading for the kind of postdoc fellowship, how did you find that? Was it quite a big change in science, quite a big change in pace?
Science-wise, no, because I purposely wrote my fellowship as an extension to my PhD. So whereas my PhD looked at Southern African rainfall and the Atlantic controls, so oceanic controls, my fellowship expanded out to look at all other influences. So I spent a lot of time looking at land surface interactions, soil moisture interactions, vegetation changes, expanding out to not just southern Africa, but the rest of the tropics. So I spent a lot of time looking at the Indian monsoon, for example. So science-wise, it wasn't very different from the PhD. But in terms of um, experience-wise, again, the way I did it is probably not to be recommended. The standard path, as you will all know, is you do your PhD, you do several postdocs of varying lengths, during which time you have a PI, and although, well, depending on the PI, they will either let you get on with it, or they will um, mentor you a little bit. But either way, over that time, you get experience in being an established researcher. Then you write your fellowship. If you're lucky, you win it, which means you are completely independent. To do it my way meant that I went from PhD, where I had a supervisor, two supervisors, to being completely on my own. Although I worked with lots of other colleagues who were great, I had no formal boss. So I had to very quickly up my game in terms of things like time management, planning of different milestones, planning of research papers, planning of deciding what conferences I wanted to visit, and so on. So, experience wise, it was a big difference. It was really having to get used to being my own boss, really.
And so I understand that you're now considered one of the kind of leading experts in using the Met Office's Hadley Centre model for paleoclimate, including to contributing to like CMIP6 and IPCC. So I wondered, how did you get to that point from the research you'd done previously?
Well, I'm not sure I would say I was a leading expert, but other people have. So basically, all of my early work, involved various different flavors of the Hadley Centre model. Either had M3 or had RM3B. It was known as Tracy in those days. Had Gem 1 to begin with, then had Gem 2, and finally at the moment had Gem 3. So that was always my background. But I've often said about my career that as it's gone forwards, I've gone backwards in time. So I started by looking at present day and future climate, and then I transitioned into paleoclimate, going further and further back. So starting, say, in the mid-Holocene, my expertise in Africa led me into looking at the mid-Holocene, and then other periods. So I was always had expertise in the model, and then when I moved to Bristol, where paleoclimate is clearly more of a focus than, say, Reading or elsewhere, I was involved in all of the CMIP6 paleo simulations that we contributed to the last IPCC report.
And so you just mentioned that you're at Bristol, but you're also senior research fellow at UCL. How do you find this kind of joint role? Was that always your intention, or?
No, absolutely not. And once again, I'll say the same thing. Probably not to be recommended. If there is a hard way of doing it, I seem to find it. Obviously, we all know that the usual pathway would be, but what everybody wants is a full-time academic position whereby you research and you teach and you do admin in various different combinations. I Bristol offered me the lectureship, but it was only part-time and teaching only, so a pathway 3 position, which initially I enjoyed. You know, I'd spent the last 18 years doing research only, with a little bit of teaching. And then suddenly I was doing teaching only, and I found I missed the research. I missed the research community. So I decided, given that it was part time, my only option was to find myself another job. So colleagues at UCL approached me saying, did I want to help write a proposal, which I did, and we were successful, and therefore I got into the research side again. So, as you say, now I am 50, well, actually 70% Bristol, which is teaching only, and then 50% UCL, which is, well, predominantly research only, and a bit of supervision.
And do you enjoy the kind of the supervising, mentoring side? Are there things that you've learnt as you progress through your career that you're kind of implementing now?
I mean, absolutely. I've been lucky to have a lot of really good mentors, a lot of good supervisors, or PIs, if you like. Yes, I do enjoy it. I've supervised several PhD students now, all of which have finished, apart from one that's ongoing. Yes, and I enjoy the supervision. Likewise, at Bristol, a number of postdocs that I supervise, I enjoy the mentoring. I enjoy helping other people um, progress in their career in the same way that other people have helped me.
Thanks, Charlie. So I think we're going to very soon go to this more informal Q&A where we'll stop recording. So just a warning to people, think of your questions now. You can post them in the chat or you can ask them in a moment. But before we get there, I'm going to ask one last question. So part of the reason for this Diverse Voices series is to get an idea of the diversity within the field of weather and climate, both in terms of, I guess, the variety of science, but also the scientists we have. So as you touched at the very start, perhaps the obvious question for you, Charlie, is how has your disability impacted or not your career in science and in academia?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I just realised I have just spoken for the last 15 minutes without mentioning it once, so I apologise for that. So, I mean, obviously, there have been challenges. I'd be naive to assume otherwise. I'm not aware of any active discrimination, but obviously I probably wouldn't be because nobody is going to admit it. So, have I been turned down for lectureship jobs? And I have been turned down for a lot. Because of it, I don't know. Nobody would ever admit that. Whether or not it was a factor, who knows? I rather hope not in academia. But obviously we don't know. I'd say day to day, what I've always said at whatever university I've been at, that the people I work with, colleagues, etc., have always been brilliant. Less so the actual formal management and infrastructure. So either there isn't any, or where there is, they are, very rule based, very regulated. So I mean, just as an example, when I started my degree, so we're talking 20 years ago, I went to an open day, and the open day had two parts. One was the kind of academic side, whereby I turned up with all the other potential students. I've never forgotten the head of department, so the kind of top dog in our School of Geography, lovely chap, Professor Russell King, if anybody knows him, spent basically all day showing me around, opening doors, taking me up to buildings, showing me the lift. He did absolutely everything he could when he didn't actually have to. Contrast that with the afternoon, whereby I had an interview, not an interview with the academic side, they offered me a place straight away. The interview was with all of the senior, the housing team, the occupational therapy team. And looking back, it was really bang out of order. I was sat in a room with about 10 different members of staff in a semicircle around me. For a 19-year-old, that was super intimidating. They were not interested in my academic abilities. They were only interested in how would I cope in the university world? Where would I live? How would I manage? Who would help me? Who would do this? Who would do that? What about note takers? They were only interested in the kind of physical challenges. They meant well. They were obviously wanted me to do okay, but the way of doing it was, I think, not good. And I'm sure today is different. Yeah, we're talking 20 years ago. Um, Fast forward a bit to the present day, as I said, colleagues, PIs, bosses, our local school manager have all been brilliant. But the infrastructure, well, I mean, there is actually a disability network at Bristol. I've been there since 2018. I didn't even know about it till about a month ago. It was so badly advertised, didn't know it existed. Um, I went to a meeting recently where it was suggested by somebody else that everybody with line management duties, which actually includes me, should undergo a whole list of disability related training courses. And I felt obliged to argue that I don't think that's either necessary or helpful. It would irritate line managers. Um, and the reason is, in my experience, I'm pretty sure none of my PIs have ever had any formal disability training. They've just been decent people. So I'm not sure an extra layer of bureaucracy would actually make things easier. Um, obviously there are other challenges which we can talk about later. Something my dad reminded me of. Now I don't remember saying this, but it sounded like something I would say. He once asked me years ago whether I got nervous about talking to large audiences. So EGU, for example, last year, no, 2 years ago, I gave an invited lecture. I don't know how many people were in the room, but probably about 500-ish. Um, and what I said to him was giving the lecture is the easy bit. Getting into the lecture theatre and getting to the lecture conference centre is the hard bit. So even Vienna, which is relatively straightforward because I've been so many times, is still tricky. Flying, even disregarding the climate impacts of flying. Flying is not easy. I don't like flying. It's very tricky as a wheelchair user. Public transport is almost impossible in most cities, which means I need to find a hotel that is A, accessible, and B, close to the conference centre. In Vienna, there happens to be one. Many other times there haven't been. So there are a huge number of extra challenges, even once you're in the conference centre, assuming it is accessible, which many aren't. Um, there are little things like getting onto the stage. Vast majority of stages have stairs to get up, which means you can't access the podium and so forth. In fact, last year, when I went to EGU, I'd not been for several years because of various reasons, including we all know what happened in 2020, but when I went last year, for the first time, they had a lift onto the stage, which was great, but that is fairly unusual. So yeah, there are little challenges, and I'm sure people might ask about other ones.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, we haven't had this kind of perspective on diverse voices before, so there's a lot that I'm sure many of us take for granted. And I know you say you don't like to talk about it too much, but we really appreciate you being completely candid.